Could you remember and describe how you felt or your first impression during your first trip to Lithuania?
Well, my very first impressions are very hazy, and for a very good reason. We had had the Lithuanian World Youth Days in Europe in '79, and we had the closing ceremonies where it was an all-night celebration. So we had slept very little, and myself and three other friends of mine were flying in and meeting a group in what was then called Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. We were changing planes and coming to Lithuania. So we spent most of the day trying to keep each other awake so we wouldn't miss our flights. And then we arrived fairly late at night. And my first sort of impression was the fact that I was met by a group of about 50 people, maybe even a little more, at the airport, who were all my relatives, none of whom I knew. And overwhelming would be the correct term, because everybody is an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, and you don't know any of them by name perhaps, but never having met them. So, and they all crowded into our hotel room that evening, and I was barely able to stay awake at that moment. So it was funny because under the Soviet system, locals could not come into the Intourist hotel room, so they managed to get through all the blocks and restrictions and get themselves into the hotel room. And that was about midnight before my mother finally got everybody out of the hotel room that we were going to be there. And then it was 5 days of getting to see Vilnius mostly and meeting the relatives, so it was just overwhelming at that point.
When was the next time you came to Lithuania?
My next trip to Lithuania was in 1989. A lot of things had changed in the meantime, because in 1985 I was one of the organizers. I had been the president of the Lithuanian World Youth Association for 4 years, between '83 and '87. And in 1985, well, to put it into context, in 1984, there was supposed to be the Olympics in Los Angeles. There were the Olympics, but we had organized some safe houses for those athletes who might want to defect from the Soviet regime, that they could safely hide until they became public, so they wouldn't be secretly returned, as had happened during the Montreal Olympics. So I was involved in the organization of that, and from that, and from the organization of the Baltic Peace and Freedom Cruise in 1985, which was a protest cruise by the Lithuanians, the Latvians, and the Estonians that took off out of Stockholm in '85, circled up along the Baltic coast, stopped in Helsinki commemorating the 10th anniversary of the signing of the Helsinki Accords, which were the human rights accords that were signed, and then back to Stockholm for the closing of the conference. And the Soviet government was not pleased with us, to put things mildly, and we were being tracked by several of the Soviet patrol boats from behind, out of sight but on radar, and the Swedish military were setting up control planes to make sure, because we had been threatened to be blown out of the water if we continued to do the protest. As a matter of fact, just before that, at a press conference, one of the press people asked some of the organizers what their reaction was, that some Soviet agents were trying to buy the boat out from under us. They had offered the owner of the boat a sizable sum so that we wouldn't have a boat to sail. But in the aftermath of that, I found myself on the blacklist, that I couldn't get a visa to the Soviet Union because the organizers of the event were all put on the blacklist. And in 1989 was the beginning of the Sąjūdis movement, and it was the first encounter that we had organized of the Lithuanian youth in the diaspora with the Lithuanian youth leaders from Lithuania, and it took place in Hüttenfeld in Germany at the Vasario 16 High School, which is the Lithuanian high school that was established in Germany after the war. And we had organized the meeting there, and the Lithuanians had invited us to the Lituanus Days in Lithuania in 1989. And the condition was that everybody who had participated in Hüttenfeld would get a visa and be able to participate in the days there. So my next visit was part of that, and I came with the whole group. And it was more an official delegation. We did a fair amount of official meetings, radio, television, and it was all part. It was about the same time. We were just before the hands united across the Baltics, the big protest. And I remember that Professor Landsbergis was in the same. We were on the same show with Professor Landsbergis as they were preparing that. So all of a sudden I went from visiting family to being in the midst of the whole Sąjūdis movement. So it was very different. I was very pleased to be able to come back to Lithuania. And the people that I met back there were at that time very involved in the Sąjūdis, a lot of them. And later became leaders, parliamentarians, leaders in radio and television. So it was a very both eventful and promising, because it created the contacts that were there for work in the future as well.
So what was it like being part of this movement? Were you scared, or did you feel threatened?
At that point there was we knew that there could be a possibility of danger, but also the people who lived in Lithuania, who were doing much more than we were in organizing a cruise, lived in constant danger. So we did have a sense that we were being involved in that liberation movement, in working towards freedom for Lithuania. And yes, that involved threats. We were a little scared because some of the speakers that we had were Soviet dissidents who were under constant threat and in their own countries under government protection. People like Vladimir Bukovsky and others who had been Soviet dissidents. Vladimir disappeared on us for about 3 hours in Helsinki, so we were quite worried, but everything ended up okay. He had went off with a friend and didn't tell anybody, so that worked out. But there was a lot of tension in those days. We got a great footage because we had about 60 members of the press on the boat. And one of the Soviet PT boats decided to come straight at us at one point as we were near the shore. So the BBC and others got some very good footage of a Soviet boat coming at us. But in the end, nothing bad came of it. But there were moments of true tension along the way.